Hi, I'm Izzy Mohammed, a researcher at the University of Birmingham. As part of the centenary commemorations for the First World War, we've been working on an Arts and Humanities Research Council project entitled Diverse Stories. The purpose of the project has been to explore National Lottery heritage-funded projects on the subject of BAME and Empire contributions between 1914 and 1918. Diverse Stories visited heritage projects and organisations up and down the country. We conducted audio interviews, did research and met with project participants. We took a local film production company with us, and this film is a snapshot of the breadth and the quality of some of that wonderful work across the UK.
My colleague, Surgeon Commander Manish Tayal, MBE in the Royal Navy, and I have served for a number of years in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, and during that time it's become quite apparent that very few people seem to understand the complex narrative and history of Empire troops, and I use that word advisedly, and their contribution to both the First and Second World Wars. And we found ourselves increasingly frustrated at having to explain these stories not to fellow officers or soldiers, but to the communities that those stories belong to.
I had for years known about the disquiet of many people in the Caribbean community, about the lack of awareness and lack of honour given to Caribbean people who had participated in the war.
Hardly anyone knew about the fact that 1.5 million soldiers from India had fought in the First World War, 400,000 of them Muslims. Not many people knew that at all. But when we told people about it and said, do you think it's important that more people know this? Would that be good for integration? 80% of people said, yes, that's the kind of thing we should be talking about. We think that could make a difference.
It's important to tell these stories, and particularly with the Great Water Race Riots archive, we've got the words of the men themselves. People are telling their own stories rather than having mainstream historians, and which are usually white male historians, aren't they, actually telling your story for you.
The World War I project came about actually almost by accident. I'd had relationships with people in Westminster, let's say that, governmental people, who mentioned to me that the 100th year anniversary, the centenary of World War I was going to be marked, and had I considered doing a project for the Caribbean and African servicemen who took part in World War I. Well, the project in the end became an attempt to research the involvement of Caribbean and African servicemen, and they were mostly men, but we've not tracked any women, who were involved in World War I. For that, we sought to employ a researcher, Dr. Angelina Osborne. We had a governing board, which is drawn from people from around the country, actually, who had some interest in and knowledge of World War I, as well as community challenges. Some of the key outcomes that we were looking for was to engage young people. We also had to produce a DVD, which we have done. We also produced a website, which is still up. We had a booklet produced, and then of course a significant mobile exhibition. The highlight of this project, and there were many, would be the night that marked the end of the project that we had in the New Testament Church of God, where some 700 people came together on that evening. I've worked for a very long time, and you do some good things during time. This and the culmination of this project on that evening felt like one of the most fulfilling pieces of work that I have done in my working life.
I'm here today in the Library of Birmingham to talk about some of the work we did over the First World War centenary on remembrance and on the contribution made by Commonwealth soldiers in the First World War. British Future is a think tank. We've been around for about 5-6 years. Britain is a more divided country than any of us would like at the moment. One of our roles is to try to bridge some of those divides, and actually telling this story of shared history can really make a difference to that. We set up a project called Unknown Untold, and that was specifically about telling this story of the Muslim soldiers who fought. We went to Birmingham and brought 2 groups of teenagers, one of them Muslim, one of them white British, together to find out about this shared history and then talk to them about what that made them feel about being British and what it meant to be British. We worked in Woking at the Peace Garden where Muslim soldiers had been buried after they fought in the First World War. We held a very English Islam garden party there to explore Englishness and Islam and how the two fit together. We went to Sandhurst Military Training College to take this story to the army officers of tomorrow. We went to Bradford again where we worked with teenagers, and they actually put what they found and what they felt about Englishness into verse. They worked with a local rapper in Bradford, which was amazing. And we went to Belfast as well, where we brought together the Muslim community and the loyalist community, who had very little contact with each other. And again, finding this common ground of shared contribution in the First World War brought them together. And that was quite an amazing scenario, really, because there was a lot of suspicion between them, really, at first. And by the end of the workshop, people were exchanging phone numbers. They were going to go and do a session in the mosque. In the end, actually, the loyalist group wanted to make a mural about the Commonwealth soldiers that had fought in the First World War, which we thought was a fantastic impact. One Muslim teenager here in Birmingham actually said afterwards, "I'd never really thought about this history and that I was part of it. And I thought, am I Pakistani, am I British? I don't really know. But now I feel I can walk a bit taller in the street and I know, that I'm British and I belong here as much as anyone else." But also people who feel anxious about integration and making it work in Britain. And we just found that they really connected with this story as well, because it was something they didn't know. And I think it kind of explained to them that this is why Britain looks how it does today. This is a long history. People haven't just come over here yesterday. They've been making a contribution to Britain for over a century. And I think that provided people with a bit more context, but also a lot of reassurance.
Our current project, Journey from Home, is looking at the stories and experiences of men and women from South Asia who joined the British Armed Forces during First World War. We done a call out, as you would, and a sixth form got in touch to say, can we do this outside of school hours? And that's how we came about getting the young volunteers.
Historically, we look at VC winners, we look at large-scale narratives of a particular brigade, a particular battle group, a particular formation, and stories that are already told. And one of the challenges that we really faced was unearthing those stories which had never been exposed, and therefore there was very little literature in order to bring them to life.
Your project covered Hindu, Indian and Sikh communities from the whole sort of Indian subcontinent story. Why was it for you important that the project should cover all those groups in one?
We found that in our research, there's Muslim soldiers being celebrated in one area, Sikh soldiers or Indian soldiers being celebrated. There was nothing, no project bringing them all three together. And I think if we looked at our audience, and that's diverse, and this project not only is running in Birmingham, but in East London as well, and that's a big multicultural area as well. So what we found was really important with our market research is how do we now engage them? That's why it was so important. So we do a project or undertake a project celebrating Muslim, Sikh and Hindu soldiers.
Your project was designed to work with young people. and especially women. So can you tell us how that worked out?
When the young women said, actually, can we get involved? I didn't realise how many young women wanted to get involved, so that was a nice surprise. And also the young men, I think they often get forgotten about, but they're also contributing just as much as the women. But this is all catered for them. You know, what do you want to become, what do you want to do, and they're actually positioning themselves. So that is a real surprise for us, and we're learning from them.
What was the highlight of the project for you?
The highlight of the project for me was taking the young people to Brighton for the first time. And we're taking them to Woking Peace Garden. That was beautiful. We had a guide there to tell them all about the history. And then when they got to the Chattery Memorial Service, in the middle of a field, they went, wow, miss, this is here. And when they said thank you for, oh, you're gonna make me cry. That's when I turned to Staj and I said, everything, all the blood, sweat and tears, the application process, this is what it's all for.
Following World War I, the black population of Liverpool swelled quite dramatically, and one of the effects of white workers returning home was that a colour bar went up in employment. There's a letter in the archive from May 1919 where the Lord Mayor is concerned about these outbreaks of violence. By June, there is full-scale rioting. The police began to raid black boarding houses in the vicinity, one of which was where Charles Watton resided, a 24-year-old Bermudan seafarer. First, he managed to get away from the police and he ran, and the mob followed him. The police caught him, the mob got hold of him, he carried on running, and he either ran or was chased into the River Mersey. But what is certain is once he was in there, he was pelted with rocks and stones until he drowned. The verdict was one of death by drowning. A community member came in and presented us with the most amazing set of letters and documents from the period of May 1919 to November 1921, and these documents pertain to the plight of black servicemen and seafarers who had served during the war years. During the project, we created an exhibition of the letters and some of the most interesting documents contained in the archive. We also created a body of poetic work. Levi Tafari started by responding creatively to the archive and producing a body of poetry. We worked with an artist called Faith Bebbington who led on the creation of a black poppy sculpture. And at the end of the project, we kind of finished it all off with a publication called Great War to Race Riots. If you think about the Windrush scandal that hit the media not so many months ago and is still in the news now, the thing that shocked me most was when I compared 1919 with today. Our present government is actually more hostile and more ruthless than the British government was back then, and it was pretty bad back then.
For MBD, technology has always been part of our work. From the early days, we started out as a multimedia theatre company, so we always included things like projection and video, and sound design's been a big part of what we do. For us, VR was just a step in that journey. VR is a completely immersive space that you can put people in and that you can tell stories, and that's what we've always done. Inside the headset then, we have recreated a number of environments from the South Asian troops' story, so those being a First World War London bus. They actually used London buses to get troops to the front line. We've recreated one of the trenches and also Brighton Pavilion Hospital, as well as the Chattery Memorial sort of in the present day as well.
We connected with a a vast range of historians, organisations like the Sikh Museum, and there were temples and mosques and all sorts of people that we connected with schools as well where we could. And we were trying to invite people in. It was very much an open and a transparent project and transparent process. We worked with people from the community as well, so we had a cohort of volunteers that actually engaged in the research with us. And then from there we brought all of that learning together in a cohesive format, and then pass that on to the creative team, and from that we were able to actually write the story.
It's about understanding what people already know or don't, and how we can best tell that story, and the parts of the story that A, need to be told, B, people want to be told, and C, how we can make people connect with those and understand them from the audience perspective.
For the English community as well, or the British community, it allows them to actually see Britain in a more of a global perspective. And that's really important when, you know, we're going through this process of Brexit and so on and so forth, that rather than being inward looking, we really need to start to become more outward looking.
Forgotten Soldiers was inspired by my grandfather. My grandfather was a hero of the British Army. He served in Burma in 1944, and he was a massive inspiration and one of the most important inspirations in my life. And I just thought, you know, I wanted to document that part of history and kind of make him realise as well that, you know what, you're actually a hero of the British Army. There wasn't a lot of information out there. We went to the Imperial War Museum in Manchester and said, have you got anything? And they said, well, no, we haven't got anything. We started to research, start talking to our families, our contacts within our volunteers, and started to find out that yes, there was people in their families who had, you know, medals from World War I. And then we found out about later on about the Muslim soldiers who'd won a Victoria Cross. We wanted to kind of bring their stories to life as well. Without the volunteers and the participants that took part, it just wouldn't have been possible. It was a massive learning curve, and it was rewarding at the end of it because it created a real family atmosphere. So the products that we created at the end of the project were a DVD, which was a 30-minute documentary. It was a workshop that we created for schools. We created a website, we created a podcast, we created a children's book. We found that just the DVD trailer on its own was over 2,500 individuals that we reached who liked the trailer online. We kind of delivered workshops to over 1,200 young people in the local community, local schools and colleges. We worked with over 500 people came to visit our exhibition. Immensely proud to be a small organisation and have very few resources and have such a huge reach and legacy.
The South Asian story of the involvement in World War I is incredibly complicated because of the scale, the sheer number of people that took part, but also when you throw into that the kind of, you know, the fact that British India is not the same as what we know as India now, the South Asian continent, you know, it's more countries literally than we had, and you start to kind of realise the scale of it, but also you've got the kind of religions that go with that, the different sensitivities that come with all that.
You're delving into so much kind of emotion. People who had lost their loved ones in the war, so when you're asking them questions about sensitive issues, just going back there it's really difficult.
The challenges of the project, I think, have been around researching the individual names in the archive, because just within a time frame really, because each one of those men that's listed in the archive is really a project with itself.
We had challenges getting young people engaged, and we had to move from plan A to plan B to C to D, and eventually we succeeded in that. The challenges that we had pale into insignificance when you put that up against the enthusiasm that we found with the people that we engage with.
The biggest thing that I wanted to do in terms of Legacy was get this programme to be part of the national curriculum, so people can start understanding, especially with the current climate of the negative portrayal of Muslims in the media and this constant negative stereotype that we're seeing, that we can actually humanise this this community that have been vilified. And when we humanise a community, what I'm talking about is when you see stories that you can relate to. So you're talking about the white middle class person saying, well, actually, he fought in the war with my grandfather.
It's important for people to understand their history and to connect with it. And there are some parts of history sometimes that we want to forget. And the South Asian story is a great example of that in terms of how when there was a push for independence, when the whole mood of a country changed, then actually part of that memory was pushed under the carpet. And from our perspective over here, the teaching in schools don't take it into account, and so bits of history get lost. If we don't tell the stories, people don't know they exist. I would like to think that many more people will start to know about this story and understand the story and understand the kind of link that we have with South Asia and the debt that we owe to those soldiers.
I hope that what we will see as a result of this and other projects is a fair representation of the cross-section of people who took part in that war.
And it will be interesting to consider as a community actually how far we've come in the last 100 years.
Those stories that we're talking about, male, female, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, it doesn't really matter. And we were really trying to bring out all of those different narratives to demonstrate tangibly why we are so different and highlight that that diversity needs to be embraced today so that Britain can continue to go from strength to strength.
The significance of these projects has been the research they have done, the histories they have unearthed, and how they have come to share it. This has had a profound effect on what we know about the past and our relationship with it. This research project has been a wonderful opportunity. We have visited heritage projects up and down the country and met with the organisations involved. And what we have learned is that while each project is unique, they have all faced very similar challenges. And they all have one big question: what next?